The whole table was smiling because they thought their mystery savior was about to walk in and crown my brother as the future CEO. My father raised a toast to his leadership while I sat there holding the truth that could erase his title in one sentence. They built their entire identity on the assumption I was harmless. When they demanded to meet the investor holding $9 billion in their firm, I did not introduce a stranger. I introduced myself. My name is Ella Perez. I stopped using the name Kincaid years ago, a choice that started as a frantic attempt at independence and hardened into a necessary shield. Tonight, however, sitting at the far end of the mahogany dining table in my parents' estate outside Lexington, Kentucky, the distinction felt less like a shield and more like a target. The air in the room was so thin and pressurized, it felt as if we were dining inside a submarine that had dived too deep. The dining room had not changed in 2 decades. It was a cavernous space dominated by oil paintings of my ancestors, men who had built Kincaid Meridian Logistics from a single horse-drawn cart into a regional trucking empire. They stared down from the walls with stern, judgmental eyes, their expressions suggesting that none of us were quite living up to the legacy. The only sound was the scrape of silver forks against fine china, a rhythmic, polite noise that masked the violent tension radiating off my brother. Holden. Holden was 34 years old, but tonight he possessed the manic energy of a toddler on a sugar high. He could barely stay in his seat. He kept checking his watch, a heavy gold timepiece that cost more than the car I drove to get here. He adjusted his silk tie. He took a sip of water. He glanced at the empty chair set at the head of the table, opposite my father. That chair was the altar we were all worshiping at tonight. It was reserved for the representative of Crescent Harbor Trust, the mysterious savior entity that had injected capital into the family firm 3 times over the last 18 months. My father, Douglas Kincaid, sat at his usual spot, looking older than I remembered. The stress of the last 2 years had carved deep ravines into his face, but tonight, those lines were smoothed out by a potent mixture of scotch and relief. He looked at Holden with a gaze so full of pride, it actually made my chest ache, a dull, familiar throb I had learned to ignore. My mother, Mary Ann, was the conductor of this orchestra. She watched the servants pour wine with a hawk-like intensity, ensuring every glass was filled to the exact same level. When she looked at me, her eyes glazed over, sliding past my face as if I were a smudge on the wallpaper that she planned to have cleaned later. Then, the doorbell rang. It was not a gentle chime. It was a resonant, deep peal that echoed through the high ceilings of the house, slicing through the polite silence like a gunshot. Holden jumped up, his chair legs screeching against the hardwood floor. He was practically vibrating. "That is him," Holden said, his voice cracking slightly. "That is our investor, the one who saved the company." Douglas set his napkin down with deliberate slowness, beaming at his son. He looked at Holden as if my brother had personally walked into a burning building and carried the company ledger out on his back. Mary Ann clasped her hands together, a beatific smile spreading across her face. "Sit down, son," Douglas said, his voice rich with satisfaction. "Let the staff handle the door. We want to look composed when he enters." Holden sank back into his chair, but he kept bouncing his leg under the table. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes bright with a cruel sort of amusement. He needed to vent his adrenaline, and I had always been his favorite punching bag. "Still working your little remote job?" Ella Holden asked. He made the word remote sound like a synonym for imaginary. I took a slow sip of water, letting the cold liquid ground me. "I work at Summit Grid." "Holden, you know that, right? Software," he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Making apps or whatever it is you do. It must be nice not having real pressure. You know, actual stakes. People's livelihoods on the line." I stared at him. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, metallic and bitter. He was talking about pressure to the person who had spent every night for the last 2 years analyzing his terrible decisions, reading his debt covenants, and frantically moving funds to cover the payroll he was about to miss. He was talking about stakes to the person who owned the promissory notes that kept the lights on in this house. It pays the bills. I said simply. Marianne chimed in, her voice light and airy, the tone she used when she wanted to be insultingly polite. Well, we are just glad you could make it. Ella, it is good for you to see what real success looks like. Your brother has done a miracle here. I looked at the empty chair again, the extra chair. It loomed large in my vision. They had set it with the best crystal, the heaviest silver. They were expecting a titan of industry. They were expecting a gray-haired man in a bespoke suit who would walk in, shake Douglas's hand, and tell him that Holden was a genius. They were expecting validation. I kept my face perfectly still. The mask was heavy, but I had been wearing it since I was 16. The narrative at the table began to shift, as it always did, into a retelling of history that painted the Kincaid men as infallible heroes. It was touch and go there for a while, Douglas admitted, swirling his scotch. When the fuel prices spiked last year, I thought we might have to sell the fleet. But you didn't, Marianne said, looking at Holden. No, we didn't, Holden said, puffing out his chest. I told you, Dad. I told you that if we just projected confidence, the market would respond. And then I found Crescent Harbor. I almost choked on my water. You found them, I asked, my voice calm, though my pulse was hammering in my throat. Holden smirked. I put the signal out. Ella, in this business, it is all about who you know. I leveraged some connections, made a few calls to private equity channels. I knew we needed a partner who understood the long-term vision, not just some vulture capitalist looking to strip us for parts. Crescent Harbor saw the potential. They saw me. He actually believed it. That was the terrifying part. He had convinced himself that the anonymous emails, the blind trust structures, and the wire transfers from the Cayman Islands were a result of his personal charisma. He did not know that Crescent Harbor was just a shell name I had come up with while staring at a painting of a boat in my living room in Minneapolis. They certainly invested a lot of capital, I said, keeping my eyes on my plate. $9 billion in valuation implies a significant commitment, Douglas said, correcting me with a tone of authority. That is what we are valued at now, thanks to the latest round. And tonight, we are going to finalize the board structure. Douglas looked at Holden with misty eyes. I am going to propose that the investor representative takes a seat on the board, obviously, but I'm also going to announce that you, Holden, will be named CEO effective next month. I will stay on as chairman, but it is time. You brought us back from the brink. You deserve the chair. Holden looked like he might cry. Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down. I gripped my fork so hard my knuckles turned white. They were doing it. They were actually going to hand the keys to the kingdom to the arsonist who had set the fire. Holden had not saved the company. He had over-leveraged the fleet to buy a warehouse district that sat empty for 8 months. He had ignored safety compliance audits that nearly cost us our Department of Transportation certification. The only reason the company was solvent was because I had stepped in, quietly, invisibly, purchasing the debt and injecting cash whenever the balance sheet bled red. I had done it to save the workers. I had done it to save the legacy my grandfather built. I had even done it, in some sick, twisted way, to save them from the humiliation of bankruptcy. But they did not see a rescue. They saw a coronation. Marianne turned to me, her smile tight. You should be happy for your brother. Ella, I know it is hard for you, being well, where you are in life, but try not to be so sour. I am not sour. Mother, I said, I am just waiting. Waiting for what? Holden laughed. The dessert cart. Or are you waiting for your little paycheck to clear? The insults were lazy, practiced. They were the same insults they had used when I was 20, when I left to study computer science instead of logistics management. They built their entire reality on the foundation that I was the failure and Holden was the success. If that foundation cracked, the whole house would come down. The doorbell rang again. This time, the silence that followed was heavy, awkward. He is late, Douglas grumbled, checking his watch. It is 7:15. Traffic, Holden said quickly, defending his imaginary hero. The drive out from the airport can be brutal. Or maybe he is just making an entrance. Power move. I respect that. Holden looked at me, a sneer curling his lip. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear, probably a bit over your head. Ella, these high-level meetings. If you want to take your plate into the kitchen and eat with the staff once he gets here, no one would blame you. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable when the adults start talking business. The cruelty was breathtaking. It was not just that he wanted me gone. He wanted me to erase myself. He wanted me to agree that I did not belong at my own family's table. I looked at the empty chair. I looked at the heavy oak door that led to the foyer. I could hear the murmur of the housekeeper talking to someone in the hallway. I looked at my father, who was checking his reflection in a spoon, making sure his tie was straight. I looked at my mother, who was arranging the centerpiece, oblivious to the fact that her son was a hollow shell of a businessman. They were so sure, they were so incredibly, arrogantly sure that the universe worked the way they wanted it to. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. Put that away. Ella, Douglas snapped. We have a guest arriving. Show some respect. I ignored him. My thumb hovered over the screen. I had a message draft open to Elena Markham, the high-powered attorney standing on the other side of that front door. She had been waiting in the cold for 5 minutes, as instructed. Holden laughed. Let her text her friends. Dad, probably complaining about how boring we are. I looked Holden dead in the eyes. The air in the room seemed to freeze. For the first time all night, I let the mask slip just a fraction. I let him see the cold, hard calculation underneath. I am not texting a friend, I said softly. Holden faltered. His smile twitched. The doorbell rang a third time. Impatient now. Urgent. Holden looked at the door, then back at me. Confusion rippled across his face, a crack in the porcelain. I pressed send. The message was one word, now. I placed the phone face down on the table with a soft click. Who is it? Marianne asked, looking toward the hallway, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Why aren't they bringing him in? I folded my hands in my lap. I sat up straighter. I occupied the space in my chair not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as the majority shareholder of Kincaid Meridian Logistics. The heavy double doors to the dining room began to open. Holden stood up again, adjusting his jacket, a desperate smile plastered on his face. Here we go, he whispered. I did not stand. I did not smile. I just watched the door. And for the first time in 11 years, I did not feel like background furniture. I felt like the person holding the match. The doors swung wide. The room went silent. But it wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore. It was the silence of a vacuum. The second before the pressure wave hits, Holden's smile froze. The person walking through the door was not a man. It was not a stranger, and she was not alone. My attorney, Elena, stepped into the light, her briefcase in hand, her face unreadable, and behind her, the hallway was empty. There was no investor, there was no savior, there was only the echo of the doorbell, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the only person in the room who knew what was happening was the one they had spent a lifetime ignoring. Douglas looked at Elena, then at Holden, then at me. I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding. Holden stammered, looking past Elena for the man he was expecting. We are waiting for the representative from Crescent Harbor. Elena stopped at the foot of the table. She did not look at Holden. She looked directly at me. I met her gaze and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The dinner was over. The meeting was about to begin. To understand why I sat at that table with a nuclear weapon disguised as a legal document, you have to understand the silence of 11 years ago. It was not the stunned silence of a boardroom ambush. It was the suffocating, cotton-thick silence of a family that had decided you were irrelevant. I was 27 years old. It was Christmas Eve, and the Kincaid estate was dressed in its holiday armor. Garlands of fresh pine wrapped around the banisters, and the smell of roasting goose was heavy enough to coat the back of your throat. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for that night. I did not buy gifts. Instead, I had compiled a 60-page comprehensive analysis of the company's logistics inefficiencies. I had mapped out how integrating a cloud-based fleet management system could cut fuel costs by 12% and reduce driver turnover by optimizing routes. I waited until the dessert course. It was the only time Douglas stopped talking about himself long enough to breathe. I cleared my throat and slid the bound document across the polished oak. I think we are missing a massive opportunity in the Midwest corridor. I said. My voice shook. Just a little. If we upgrade the legacy dispatch software, we can predict maintenance failures before they happen. I have outlined the vendor options here. Douglas looked at the binder as if I had placed a dead rat next to his plum pudding. He did not open it. He did not even read the title. He just smiled that tight, pitying smile that hurts worse than a slap. Ella, honey, he said, his voice dropping an octave, the way one speaks to a slow child. We are eating, and besides, you know I do not like fixing things that aren't broken. Trucks run on diesel. Sweetie, they do not run on data, but we are losing margin. I insisted. I showed him the graph on the cover. Holden is buying new tractors, but we aren't utilizing the ones we have efficiently. Holden, who was 23 at the time and fresh out of a business degree he had barely passed, laughed. He crumbled a piece of bread roll between his fingers. You are playing video games. Ella, Holden said. Computers aren't a real industry. Trucks are real. Warehouses are real. You can't haul steel with a spreadsheet. You are trying to make things complicated because you don't understand the grit of the job. I looked to my mother for support. Marianne was checking her reflection in the back of a spoon. Your brother is right, she said vaguely. Why do you always have to make life harder than it needs to be? Ella, you are 27. When I was 27, I had a toddler and a house to run. Maybe if you focused less on telling your father how to do his job and more on finding a nice man, you wouldn't be so angry all the time. I felt the heat rise up my neck. It wasn't anger. It was desperation. I was trying to hand them a map to the future, and they were mocking me for not using a compass. That was the night I realized I was not a Kincaid to them. I was an accessory. I was a placeholder until I could be married off to someone who would take me off the payroll. I left 2 days later. I did not storm out. I did not make a scene. I simply packed my life into my Honda Civic and drove north. I chose Minneapolis because it was cold. It was industrious. And it was 800 miles away from the suffocating expectations of Lexington. I needed to breathe. I needed to know if I was actually the incompetent dreamer they said I was, or if I was something else. I landed a job at Summit Grid Software within a week. It was a remote role, unglamorous back-end development and systems architecture. For the first time in my life, nobody cared about my last name. They cared about my code. If my syntax was clean, I was rewarded. If my logic was sound, I was respected. It was a meritocracy, and I drank it in like water in a desert. I lived quietly. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a converted flour mill. I drove that same Honda until the rust ate the wheel wells. I wore sweaters I bought on sale and cooked my own meals. To the outside world, I was just another mid-level tech worker living a modest, solitary life. I stopped going home for holidays. I sent cards. I sent generic gifts. I became exactly what they wanted me to be: invisible. Then, 3 years after I left, my grandfather died. Arthur Kincaid had been the one who started it all. He was a hard man, but he was fair. And unlike my father, he respected numbers. He had bypassed my father's control for a portion of his estate, leaving direct bequests to his grandchildren. The lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning. I remember standing in my small kitchen, holding a mug of lukewarm coffee, listening to the dry recitation of the will. To my grandson, Holden. The lawyer read, I leave my collection of vintage firearms and the hunting lodge in Montana. I waited. I expected a token, maybe a few $1,000s, maybe a piece of jewelry. And to my granddaughter, Ella, the lawyer continued, I leave the liquid contents of my personal investment portfolio, totaling $5,400,000. After taxes, I nearly dropped the phone. $5 million. In the world of Kincaid Meridian Logistics, where operating costs ran into the hundreds of millions, $5 million was a rounding error. It was nothing. To my father, it was pocket change. To Holden, it was the price of a few fancy tractors. They likely laughed when they heard the amount, thinking the old man had given me just enough to stay away comfortably. But to a normal person, to a woman living on a junior developer's salary in Minneapolis, it was an arsenal. I sat on my floor for hours that day. I looked at the bank transfer when it hit. I looked at the zeros. I could have bought a house. I could have traveled the world. I could have started my own software firm and never looked back. But I couldn't let go. That is the sickness of family. You can hate them. You can leave them. But you cannot excise the part of you that wants to protect the name you carry. I started watching the company from the outside. I pulled their public filings. I monitored their DOT safety scores. I subscribed to industry trade journals that track their market share. What I saw made my stomach turn. Without Arthur's steady hand, Douglas was drifting. He was letting Holden play CEO without the title. They were expanding into markets they didn't understand, buying real estate at peak prices, and neglecting the core fleet. They were bleeding. It was a slow bleed, the kind that feels like warmth until you realize you are dying. I tried to call my father once, about 6 months after the inheritance. "Dad," I said, "I saw the quarterly report. The debt-to-equity ratio is getting dangerous. If interest rates shift even half a percentage point, the service payments on those new loans will eat the entire profit margin." "Ella, please," he sighed. "We have advisors. We have bankers. We do not need our daughter lecturing us from an apartment in Minnesota. Enjoy your grandfather's money. Buy some nice clothes." He hung up. That click was the catalyst. That soft, dismissive disconnect was the moment Ella Kincaid truly died, and the investor was born. If they would not listen to my voice, they would have to listen to my money. I did not want revenge. Not then. I wanted to put a floor under them. I wanted to catch the falling knife before it severed the artery of the company my grandfather built. I loved the company. I loved the drivers who had taught me how to shift gears when I was 12. I loved the dispatchers who remembered my birthday. I loved the smell of diesel and the hum of the loading docks. I refused to let my brother's ego burn it to the ground. So, I formed the Crescent Harbor Trust. I did not do it alone. I hired a trustee, a man named Marcus, who asked no questions as long as the fees were paid. We set up a blind structure. I moved my grandfather's $5 million into the trust. It wasn't enough to buy control, not yet, but it was enough to start playing the game. I learned the language of leverage. I spent my nights after work studying financial instruments. I learned about convertible notes, preferred shares, and distress financing. I lived like a monk, saving 80% of my salary, funneling every spare cent into the trust. I wasn't gambling. I was hunting. I watched the market. When the logistics sector took a hit and Kincaid stock dipped, I bought. I didn't buy big blocks that would trigger a disclosure warning. I bought in small, steady drips. I was a ghost in the ledger. It gave me a strange, intoxicating sense of power. By day, I was Ella, the quiet coder who brought potluck dishes to office parties. By night, I was the entity analyzing Kincaid Meridian's balance sheet better than their own CFO. I remember the first time I saved them. It was 2 years after the inheritance. They had missed a covenant on a major loan. The bank was threatening to call in the debt. If they did, the company would have faced immediate liquidity issues. Bankruptcy was weeks away. I sat in my apartment, looking at the numbers. I could let them crash. It would serve them right. It would prove I was right. But I thought of the 300 drivers who would lose their pensions. I thought of the legacy. I had Marcus contact the bank. Crescent Harbor Trust offered to buy the debt. We restructured it, gave them breathing room, and took a position in preferred equity as payment. My father threw a party when the deal went through. I saw the photos on social media. Holden was toasting with champagne, taking credit for finding a flexible partner. They had no idea that the flexible partner was the daughter they had told to go find a husband. It wasn't malice that drove me. It was a desperate need to be real. Every share I bought was a brick in a wall of proof. Proof that I existed. Proof that I was competent. proof that I was worthy of the seat at the table they had denied me. But as the years went on, and the bailouts became more frequent, the love began to curdle. I watched Holden buy a boat while the company borrowed money to pay for fuel. I watched my mother remodel the estate kitchen for the third time, while I authorized a bridge loan to cover payroll taxes. The silence of my life in Minneapolis became a waiting room. I was waiting for the inevitable. I knew they would eventually run out of luck. I knew they would eventually back themselves into a corner so tight that no amount of charm could get them out. And I knew that when that day came, I would be the only one holding the key. I drove an old sedan, not because I had to, but because every dollar I didn't spend on myself was a dollar I could use to buy another piece of their fate. I wore off-the-rack suits to work, but I owned the mortgage on their headquarters. They thought I was miles away, living a small, inconsequential life. They didn't know I was right there in the room with them, woven into the contracts, embedded in the capital structure, holding the roof up over their heads while they mocked me for standing in the rain. I wasn't just investing in a company, I was investing in a moment, the moment when the doorbell would ring, and the polite fiction of their lives would finally shatter against the hard, cold reality of mine. The transformation from an angry daughter into a majority shareholder did not happen in a montage of fast-paced victories. It happened in the quiet, grinding hours between midnight and 4 a.m, illuminated by the blue light of 2 computer monitors in a Minneapolis apartment that smelled perpetually of stale coffee. I had the capital from my grandfather, but capital without intelligence is just kindling waiting for a spark. I knew how to write code, how to structure a database, and how to optimize a server stack. I knew nothing about corporate governance, debt covenants, or the intricate machinery of high finance logistics, so I went to school. My classroom was the Edgar database of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the pile of trade publications I subscribed to under a pseudonym. Night after night, after finishing my shift at Summit Grid, I would close my work laptop and open my personal machine. I learned to read a balance sheet not just for the numbers, but for the secrets hiding in the footnotes. I learned that profit is an opinion, but cash is a fact. I studied the margins of trucking competitors, analyzing why Old Dominion thrived while YRC struggled. I memorized the fuel surcharge tables. I learned exactly how much a Class 8 tractor depreciated the moment it drove off the lot. I treated Kincaid Meridian Logistics not as my family's business, but as a biological specimen I was dissecting. I pulled every public filing available. Since the company had taken on outside debt years ago to fuel Douglas's earlier expansions, they had reporting requirements. I read them all. I found the cracks in the foundation that nobody else was looking for. But knowledge was not enough. I needed a vehicle. I could not simply write a check signed by Ella Perez. The moment my name appeared on a term sheet, Douglas would shred it, and Holden would laugh. I needed a mask that looked like a fortress. I found Elena Markham 6 months into my research. She was not a strip mall lawyer, nor was she one of the flashy corporate sharks who advertised on billboards. She was a partner at a boutique firm in Chicago that specialized in blind trusts and high net worth anonymity. I met her in a diner halfway between Minneapolis and Chicago. I wore a gray hoodie and jeans. She wore a suit that cost more than my car. I remember sliding the folder across the sticky table. Inside was my proof of funds and a diagram of what I wanted to build. Elena drank her black coffee and read the papers in silence. She read for 20 minutes while I picked at a muffin. Finally, she looked up. "This is aggressive," she said. Her voice was neutral, professional. "You are looking to acquire distressed debt with a conversion clause. You want to be the lender of last resort." "Yes," I said, "and you want the entity to be completely opaque." She continued, "The target company cannot know the beneficiary. They can never know." I answered. Elena nodded. She did not ask why. She did not ask about the morality of targeting my own family. She simply billed me by the hour. We created the Crescent Harbor Trust the following week. We chose the name because it sounded vague, established, and safe. It sounded like old money. It sounded like the kind of institution Douglas Kincaid would respect. We hired a professional trustee service to sign the documents. My name was buried so deep in the paperwork that you would need a subpoena and a forensic accountant to find it. However, the beginning was not a straight line up. I almost lost everything before I even started. Early on, I got arrogant. I saw a fuel futures contract that looked like a sure thing. I thought I could double my grandfather's money in a month by predicting a spike in diesel prices due to a hurricane forecast in the Gulf. I put nearly $500,000 into the position. The hurricane turned east. The fuel prices dropped. The contract expired worthless. I lost $500,000 in 48 hours. I remember sitting on my bathroom floor, staring at the tile, feeling the physical sickness of panic. That was money I could never replace. I had treated the market like a casino, and the house had won. I realized then that I was not smarter than the market. I was small, and I was vulnerable. I stopped gambling that day. I swore I would never again bet on what I thought would happen. I would only invest in what was already broken. I shifted my strategy from speculation to patience. I became a vulture. I waited. I watched the logistics sector enter a recession, when the market hated trucking, when fuel costs were high and shipping volumes were low. That is when I woke up. The first opportunity came 18 months after I started. Kincaid Meridian was facing a liquidity crisis. Holden had convinced Douglas to upgrade the trailer fleet right before a major drop in retail shipping. They had the new trailers, but they did not have the cash to pay the quarterly insurance premiums. If they missed the payment, their operating authority would be suspended. They needed $3 million, fast. The banks were closed to them because their debt-to-EBITDA ratio was already too high. They were toxic to traditional lenders. I instructed Elena to make the call. Crescent Harbor Trust approached the Kincaid CFO with an offer. We would provide a bridge loan of $3 million. The interest rate was high, 8%, but the terms were quick. The catch was the structure. It was a convertible note. If the company failed to repay the principal within 24 months, or if they missed a covenant, the debt would convert into equity. Specifically, preferred shares with voting rights. They took the money. They had no choice. I remember the adrenaline spike when Elena confirmed the wire transfer. I owned a piece of them. It was a debt piece, but it was a foothold. 6 months later, they needed more. Holden had miscalculated the cost of a new logistics hub in Ohio. They were over budget by $2 million. Again, the bank said no. Again, Crescent Harbor stepped in. This time, I demanded steeper terms. I asked for warrants, the right to buy stock at a fixed price in the future. Douglas signed the papers. He was so relieved to have the cash that he didn't read the fine print about what would happen if the company valuation dropped. The most surreal part was listening to my family talk about me. I still called home occasionally, maintaining the charade of the distant, struggling daughter. During one call, Holden brought up the investor. We have this group out of Chicago. Holden bragged, Crescent Harbor. They are very private, very exclusive. They reviewed our operations and realized we are undervalued. They believe in my vision. Ella, they are pouring millions into the company because they know I am going to take it to the next level. I gripped the phone tight. He had turned a predator into a patron. He had convinced himself that the shark circling the boat was actually a dolphin guiding him to safety. They sound smart, I said, my voice flat. They are, Holden said. They understand that you have to spend money to make money. Unlike you. By the way, Mom says you are still driving that 10-year-old Honda. It is embarrassing. Ella, it was embarrassing. Perhaps, to him, to me, it was strategic camouflage. I kept my lifestyle aggressively modest. I stayed in the same apartment. I clipped coupons. I wore clothes until they wore out. My colleagues at Summit Grid thought I was saving for a house or paying off student loans. They had no idea that the woman eating a turkey sandwich in the break room had just authorized a $4 million capital injection into a mid-sized logistics firm. Invisibility was my shield. If I had shown up in a Mercedes or bought a condo in the upscale part of town, questions would be asked. My parents would wonder where the money came from. They would dig, and if they dug, they might find the trust. So I played the part of the poor relation. When I visited for holidays, I let them pay for dinner. I let Marianne slip $100 bill into my pocket and tell me to buy something nice. I took the money and deposited it into the trust account. Every single dollar they gave me out of pity. I used to buy another fraction of their control. The accumulation continued for 3 years. It was a slow strangulation. Every time the company hit a rough patch, a lawsuit from a driver, a spike in insurance costs, a lost contract, Crescent Harbor was there. We were the friendly voice on the phone offering a lifeline. But every lifeline came with a hook. By the time of the dinner party, I had converted the initial notes into equity. I had exercised the warrants. I had bought out a silent partner from the founding days who wanted to retire. I had amassed preferred shares that carried 10 times the voting weight of the common stock my father held. The valuation of $9 billion that Douglas was so proud of, that was real. But what he didn't understand was the cap table. He looked at the top-line number and saw success. I looked at the shareholder registry and saw ownership. I knew the bylaws of the company better than the corporate secretary. I knew that the preferred shares I held gave me the right to appoint the majority of the board if the company missed 3 consecutive quarters of profit targets. They had missed 4. I had been sitting on the trigger for months, waiting for the right moment. I did not want to pull it over an email. I did not want to pull it during a conference call. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted them to see me. The secrecy had been absolute. Elena was the only human being on earth who knew the truth. To the rest of the world, Ella Perez was a nobody. But in the ledger, in the cold, hard mathematics of business, I was the titan they were waiting for. I was the one who had kept the fuel tanks full. I was the one who had paid the drivers. I was the one who had saved the Kincaid legacy from the Kincaids. And as I sat at my desk in Minneapolis, looking at the final consolidation of shares that gave me 51% control, I felt a strange hollowness. It wasn't triumph. It was the heavy, solemn weight of responsibility. Holden thought the investor was coming to crown him. He did not realize the investor had been watching him fail for 3 years, noting every error, every ego-driven mistake, every wasted dollar. He thought he was the hero of the story. He didn't know he was the liability. I closed my laptop, rubbed my tired eyes, and looked around my small, dark apartment. It was time to go home. It was time to introduce them to the reality I had built in the dark. The year leading up to that dinner party was not just bad. It was a catastrophe that moved in slow motion. In the logistics industry, we call it a correction. But what happened to Kincaid Meridian was a dismantling. It started with the fuel. Diesel prices did not just rise. They became volatile in a way that made forecasting impossible. In January, the national average for on-highway diesel spiked 40 cents a gallon in 3 weeks. For a fleet the size of ours, that is not an inconvenience. That is a hemorrhage. Every time a driver filled up a tank in Ohio or Texas, the profit margin for that load evaporated before the truck even left the pump. Then came the insurance renewals. The entire transportation sector was getting hammered by nuclear verdicts in accident lawsuits, and premiums across the board jumped 30%. Kincaid Meridian, with its aging fleet and a few safety infractions that Holden had swept under the rug, was hit with a 50% increase. The company was bleeding cash from both arteries operations and overhead. Any competent CEO would have slammed on the brakes. They would have frozen hiring, renegotiated vendor contracts, and parked the least efficient trucks to save on maintenance. Holden did the opposite. He decided that the way out of the crisis was to grow. He called it capturing market share while the competition retreats. I called it suicide. Holden announced the groundbreaking of a new, state-of-the-art cold storage distribution center outside of Nashville. It was a massive, shiny project with automated racking systems and a glass-walled administrative wing that looked more like a tech campus than a trucking terminal. The projected cost was $12 million. The lease terms were predatory, locking the company into payments that would cripple us if revenue dropped even 5%. I watched from my desk in Minneapolis as he presented the plan to the trade press. He looked handsome and confident in the photos, standing in a hard hat, pointing at a pile of dirt. He spoke about synergy and vertical integration. He did not mention that the company had less than 3 weeks of operating cash in the bank. My father, Douglas, ate it up. That was the tragedy of their dynamic. Douglas was terrified of the modern market. He did not understand the algorithms or the digital freight brokers that were undercutting his prices. So when Holden spoke with absolute certainty, using buzzwords that sounded impressive, Douglas clung to him, to my father. Confidence sounded like leadership. He did not realize that a man walking off a cliff often looks confident right until the moment gravity takes over. The real breaking point, however, was not the building. It was the Sterling retail contract. Sterling was our whale. They accounted for 22% of our annual revenue. We hauled their frozen goods across 6 states. Losing Sterling would not just hurt, it would kill the company. In May, Sterling quietly sent a notice of audit. They were updating their vendor compliance standards. They required all carriers to have real-time digital temperature monitoring with historical data backup for the last 12 months. It was a standard request in the modern food safety landscape. We did not have it. Holden had cut the IT budget to pay for the architectural renderings of his Nashville palace. The temperature loggers in our refrigerated trailers were 3 years old and required manual downloading at the terminal. They were not real-time, and they certainly were not cloud-integrated. If we failed the audit, Sterling would trigger the termination clause in the contract. We would lose the revenue, but we would still be on the hook for the truck leases we had signed to service them. I saw the audit notice because I had access to the server backend. I saw the panic emails flying between the operations manager and Holden. We need to buy the upgrade, the manager wrote. It is $400,000 for the fleet hardware. We do not have it, Holden replied. Stall them. Tell them we are transitioning systems. Send them the manual logs and tell them the data is corrupted if they ask for more. He was going to lie to a Fortune 500 client. He was going to gamble the entire company on the hope that a compliance officer at Sterling would be too lazy to check. The bank smelled the rot before the audit even happened. Our primary lender, a regional bank that had backed the Kincaids for 30 years, suddenly tightened the leash. They sent a letter invoking a material adverse change clause. They wanted to review the books. They wanted to interview the executive team. They were asking the question that terrified Douglas the most. Who is actually steering this ship? I sat in my apartment, watching the stock ticker of our competitors. Knowing that my family was drowning, I had the power to save them. I had the capital in Crescent Harbor Trust. But I was also their daughter, and a foolish, sentimental part of me wanted to try one last time to save them as Ella. I called my parents on a Tuesday evening. When my father answered, he sounded exhausted. His voice was thin, lacking its usual boom. "Hi, Dad," I said. "I was just reading about the fuel surcharges. It looks brutal out there. We are handling it." "Ella," he said shortly, "the market cycles. We have seen it before." I hesitated. I gripped the phone so hard my hand cramped. "Dad, I heard rumors about the Sterling contract requirements. The industry is moving toward real-time data. If the company needs help with the software transition, I know people. I could look at the specs. I could maybe help you find a cheaper vendor." There was a silence on the line. For a second, just 1 second, I thought he might listen. I thought he might say, "Yes, Ella, we are in trouble. Please help us." Instead, he sighed, a sound of heavy impatience. "Ella, stop," he said. "You do not know what you are talking about. Sterling is fine. Holden has a great relationship with their VP of Logistics. They played golf last month. Business isn't about software specs. It is about relationships." But the audit I started— "Enough," Douglas snapped. "Why do you always call to criticize your brother is building a $12 million facility in Nashville? He is expanding the empire, and you are calling me to nag about temperature sensors. This is why you are not involved. Ella, you missed the forest for the trees." He hung up. I put the phone down. I felt cold, but it was a clarifying cold. It burned away the last shreds of guilt I had been carrying. He had just told me that a golf game was more important than data integrity. He had told me that my concern was nagging. They did not want my help. They did not respect my mind. So I gave them what they wanted. I gave them money, and I took their freedom in exchange. The next morning, Elena Markham contacted the Kincaid CFO on behalf of Crescent Harbor Trust. We offered emergency financing to cover the capital expenditure needs, which was code for the $400,000 hardware upgrade they desperately needed to pass the Sterling audit, plus enough to make the payroll for the next 2 months. But this time, the terms were not friendly. We demanded a senior secured position on all assets, meaning if they went bust, we got the trucks and the buildings before the bank got a dime. We demanded a strict covenant on operational cash flow, and most importantly, we included a clause that stated if the company failed to meet the new financial targets for 2 consecutive quarters, Crescent Harbor Trust would have the right to appoint a chief restructuring officer with executive authority. It was a trap. I knew they would miss the targets. Holden's Nashville project was bleeding money, and the fuel costs were not going down. I was essentially asking them to sign a document that handed me the company in 6 months. Douglas signed it. He signed it because payroll was due on Friday, and he could not bear the shame of telling his drivers their checks would bounce. 2 days later, the money hit the Kincaid accounts. They bought the sensors. They passed the Sterling audit by the skin of their teeth. They paid the drivers. And then, Holden went on the attack. He did not thank the universe for the reprieve. He did not humble himself. He spun the narrative. I saw the internal memo he sent to the staff. Team, it read, I am thrilled to announce that I have secured a significant new round of investment from our strategic partners at Crescent Harbor. This capital will fuel our expansion into Nashville and proves that the market has absolute confidence in our direction. While other carriers are shrinking, Kincaid Meridian is growing. He was taking credit for the noose I had just tightened around his neck. I printed out that memo and taped it to the wall above my monitor. That was the moment I realized the danger was not bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is just math. You sell the assets, you pay the creditors, you move on. The danger was Holden. He was a malignant force. He was driving the firm into a cliff at 80 miles an hour while demanding applause from the passengers. He truly believed he was untouchable. He believed that the money appeared because he deserved it. He did not understand that the strategic partner he was bragging about was the sister he had mocked for driving a used car. The months ticked by. The Nashville facility opened and sat half empty. Just as I predicted, the lease payments started eating into the operating cash. They missed the first financial target in the Crescent Harbor contract. Then they missed the second. The trap snapped shut. Legally, I now had the right to walk into that building and fire everyone. I owned the debt. I owned the voting shares. And I owned the governance triggers. But I waited. I waited for the annual strategic dinner. I waited until they were all gathered, celebrating their own brilliance, rewriting history to erase their failures. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted Holden to stand up and toast his own genius. Because the fall is always harder when you think you are flying. The prime rib on the table was rare, bleeding red juice onto the white porcelain in a way that made my stomach turn. I pushed a piece of meat around my plate, watching the way the candlelight flickered against the heavy crystal goblets. We were back in the present moment, seated in the dining room that felt more like a courtroom than a home. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive perfume, but underneath it, I could smell the familiar, metallic tang of anxiety. Holden was performing. There was no other word for it. He was not eating. He was broadcasting. Every gesture was calibrated to look executive. He held his wineglass by the stem, swirling the vintage Cabernet with a practiced nonchalance that he had undoubtedly copied from a movie about Wall Street. It is all about scalability, Holden said, his voice projecting to the back of the room as if he were addressing a shareholder meeting rather than his parents and his estranged sister. The investor understands that. That is why they are coming tonight. They know that what we are building in Nashville is not just a warehouse. It is a logistics ecosystem. Douglas nodded, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on his son with a desperate sort of adoration. You have the vision, son. That is what matters. The market fluctuates, but vision is permanent. I took a sip of water to wash down the bile rising in my throat. They were congratulating each other on a building that was currently operating at 30% capacity and losing $40,000 a month in overhead. They were praising a vision that was funded entirely by the high-interest debt I owned. Marianne turned her gaze toward me. It was a slow, sweeping look that took in my off-the-rack blazer, my unstyled hair, and my lack of jewelry. She smiled, and the expression was filled with a terrifying, pitying warmth. "You are so quiet tonight, Ella," she said softly. "I am just listening." I replied, "It must be overwhelming for you." She continued, tilting her head, "All this talk of millions and mergers. I was telling your father just the other day how nice it must be to have a simple life like yours." I set my fork down. "A simple life. You know what I mean," she said, reaching out to pat my hand. Her skin was cool and dry. "You clock in, you clock out. You do not have to worry about the legacy. You do not have to carry the weight of 300 families on your shoulders like your brother does. It is a blessing. Really, not everyone is built for stress. Some people are just meant to be comfortable." She made the word comfortable sound like a synonym for failure. She was rewriting my entire existence into a cautionary tale of mediocrity. In her mind, I was the daughter who couldn't hack it, the one who retreated to a small apartment to hide from the glare of their brilliance. She had no idea that the stress she claimed I couldn't handle was actually the stress I was inflicting upon them. "I suppose I do value stability," I said, keeping my voice even. Holden laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Stability is just a nice word for stagnation." "Ella," he said. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket to reveal the custom lining. "Look, do not feel bad. Someone has to do the grunt work. If everyone was a CEO, who would write the code? Or whatever it is you do. I write the code that ensures you do not get flagged by the Department of Transportation. I thought, I write the checks that keep the lights on in this house." I looked at Douglas. I wanted him to say something. I wanted him to defend me, even a little. But he just looked at his watch, then at the empty chair at the head of the table. "He is 20 minutes late," Douglas muttered. "He is testing us," Holden said, waving a hand dismissively. "It is a power move. I respect it. When you control $9 billion in capital, you do not look at a clock. You arrive when you arrive. He probably wants to see if we unravel, but we won't. We are Kincaids." The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical puncture wound. Holden was right about one thing: the investor was testing them, but he was wrong about the gender, and he was wrong about the location. The investor was not stuck in traffic. The investor was sitting across from him, wondering if he had ever actually read the profit and loss statement he signed last week. Holden turned his eyes back to me, sensing he had an audience for his cruelty. "You know, Ella," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone, "if this meeting gets too intense, and it will, you can step out. We are going to be discussing complex equity structures and governance rights. I do not want you to feel embarrassed if you cannot follow the conversation." I stared at him. The candlelight reflected in his eyes, masking the fear I knew was hiding there. He was terrified. He was terrified that the investor would ask a question he couldn't answer. He was using me as a punching bag to steady his own shaking hands. "I think I will be able to keep up," I said. Holden smirked. "Cute, but seriously, when the heavy hitters walk in, just try to fade into the background. Do not bring up your little computer theories. This is the big leagues." The room felt suddenly too small. The heat from the fireplace, the smell of the roast, the suffocating weight of their arrogance, it was all too much. I needed air. I needed to reset the mask before I let it drop forever. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I am going to get some fresh air," I said. Marianne sighed. "Oh, Ella, do not go far. It is rude to be absent when a guest arrives. I won't be far," I promised. I walked out of the dining room, down the long hallway lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors, and out the front door. The night air of Kentucky was cold and damp. It smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. I walked to the edge of the stone porch and gripped the railing. The limestone was rough under my palms, grounding me. I closed my eyes and breathed. I counted backward from 10. For 11 years, I had been the ghost. I had been the shadow. I had let them define me because it was safer than letting them know me, but tonight, the safety ended. Tonight, the ghost was becoming flesh and bone. I heard the crunch of gravel on the driveway. I opened my eyes. A black sedan had pulled up silently, its headlights cut. It was not a limousine. It was a practical, high-end town car. The back door opened, and a woman stepped out. Elena Markham was 45 years old, with hair the color of steel wool and eyes that could read a contract from across the room. She wore a charcoal suit that was tailored to perfection, and she carried a leather briefcase that looked like it contained secrets of state. She did not smile. She did not wave. She simply walked up the steps to where I stood. She looked at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. "Are we doing this?" she asked. Her voice was low, devoid of drama. To her, this was a transaction, a governance correction. I looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of the dining room. I could see Holden pouring another glass of wine. I could see my mother laughing at something Douglas said. They looked like a picture-perfect family. They looked like a fortress that could never be breached. I turned back to Elena. "We are doing this," I said. She nodded once, then she handed me a thick folder from her briefcase. "Here is the voting proxy," she said, "and the deed to the debt." I took the folder. It was heavy. Elena adjusted her jacket. She did not ask if I was okay. She knew that question was irrelevant. She walked to the front door and reached for the handle. But I stopped her. "No," I said. "I will open it." She stepped back, understanding. I took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs, sharp and clean. I was not Ella the daughter anymore. I was not Ella the disappointment. I was Crescent Harbor Trust. I turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy oak door open. We walked into the foyer. The house was silent. The servants had retreated to the kitchen. I could hear Holden's voice drifting from the dining room. "I am just saying, Dad," he was booming, "once we get the capital infusion, I am going to buy out that competitor in Ohio. We will dominate the lane." I walked down the hall, my heels clicking on the marble. Elena walked a step behind me, a silent sentinel. We reached the double doors of the dining room. They were closed. I did not knock. I pushed the doors open with both hands. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Holden jumped up from his seat. He smoothed his tie, his face lighting up with that desperate, eager smile. He looked toward the door, his eyes scanning the space at eye level, looking for a tall man, looking for a savior. He saw me first. His smile faltered. Confusion rippled across his face. "Ella," he said, his tone annoyed. "I thought you were outside. Move out of the way. He is—" Then he saw Elena standing behind me. He froze. He looked at Elena, taking in the briefcase, the suit, the absolute lack of deference in her posture. He looked back at me. "Where is he?" Holden asked, his voice tight. "Where is the investor?" Douglas stood up slowly, his napkin falling to the floor. Marianne put a hand to her throat. I walked into the room. I did not go to my seat at the end of the table. I walked to the head of the table. I walked to the empty chair. I placed the heavy folder on the placemat. Holden looked at the folder. He looked at me. And for the first time in his life, the arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a dawn of horrific understanding. I rested my hands on the back of the chair he had been worshipping all night. "Hello, Holden," I said. Holden blinked, his brain refusing to process the data. "Who is she?" He pointed at Elena. "Is she the assistant?" Elena stepped forward. Her voice was clear, cutting through the room like a scalpel. "I am Elena Markham, General Counsel for Crescent Harbor Trust." Holden let out a breath, a laugh bubbling up in his chest. Oh, thank God. "Okay, nice to meet you. Where is the principal? Where is the man in charge?" I pulled the chair out. The sound was loud in the silent room. I sat down at the head of the table. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. And then I looked at my brother, locking eyes with him. "There is no man." "Holden," I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. I reached into the folder and pulled out the single sheet of paper that listed the beneficial ownership of the trust. I slid it across the mahogany table until it stopped right in front of him. "Read the name," I said. Holden looked down. He read. He looked up. His face went pale, the blood draining away so fast it looked like he might faint. "No," he whispered. "Yes," I said. I picked up the wine glass that had been set for the investor. I took a sip. "Shall we begin?" The silence that followed Elena's introduction was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, the kind that exists in the split second after an explosion before the sound wave actually hits you. I sat at the head of the table, my hands resting flat on the cool wood, watching the people who had raised me struggle to comprehend the new reality I had just laid before them. Elena Markham remained standing. She did not fidget. She did not look apologetic. She stood with the absolute stillness of a professional who knew she held every ace in the deck. "I am Elena Markham," she repeated, her voice level and devoid of theatricality. "I am the lead counsel and trustee for Crescent Harbor Trust, and as of the filing closed at 4 o'clock this afternoon, I am here to represent the majority shareholder of Kincaid Meridian Logistics." Holden blinked. His brain was misfiring, unable to bridge the gap between the sister he mocked and the power structure being described. Then, his defense mechanism kicked in. He laughed. It was a loud, jagged sound that bounced awkwardly off the high ceilings. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head, looking around the table as if inviting everyone else to share in the joke. "Okay, wow," Holden said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You really had me going there for a second. Ella, this is elaborate. I will give you that. Did you hire her? Is she an actress? Because the suit is a nice touch. Very convincing." He looked at Douglas, grinning. "She is trying to get back at us for the jokes. Dad, it is a prank, a bit expensive for someone on her budget, but you have to admire the commitment." Douglas did not laugh. He was staring at Elena, and specifically at the pin on her lapel, the emblem of the American Bar Association's corporate governance section. He knew enough about the legal world to know that the woman standing there was not an actor. The quality of her leather briefcase, the weight of the paper she had placed on the table, the cold intelligence in her eyes, none of that could be rented from a casting agency. "Holden," Douglas said, his voice a low rumble of warning. "Be quiet." Holden ignored him. He was too deep in his denial. "Come on, Dad," Holden insisted. "Look at her. It is Ella. She fixes bugs in software. She lives in a 1-bedroom apartment. She drives a car that barely passes inspection. You really think she is the mysterious billionaire investor? It is absurd. It is actually pathetic that she thinks we would buy this." I did not speak. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contacts. I scrolled down to a number I had saved years ago but never used until today. It was the direct line to Walter Henderson, the corporate secretary of Kincaid Meridian. Walter was a man of the old guard, loyal to the bylaws above all else. He was the keeper of the corporate seal, the man who recorded the minutes of every board meeting. I placed the phone in the center of the table, right next to the floral centerpiece. I pressed the speaker button. The dial tone purred through the room, loud and rhythmic. "Who are you calling?" Marianne asked, her voice trembling. "Ella, stop this immediately. It is not funny anymore." The line clicked open. Kincaid Meridian, corporate secretary's office, Walter speaking. His voice was familiar, steady, and confused. It was 8 o'clock at night. He was not expecting a call. "Hello, Walter?" I said. "This is Ella Perez." There was a pause. "Oh. Hello? Ms. Perez? Is everything all right? Is your father with you?" "Yes. He is right here." I said, "But I'm not calling for him. I'm calling to confirm a transaction for the record. Walter, can you please read the top line of the updated shareholder registry that was certified by the transfer agent this afternoon?" Holden rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous. She probably bribed him." Walter cleared his throat on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of paper. "Well, yes," he said, his voice hesitant but clear. We received the certification at 4:30. The new controlling entity is Crescent Harbor Trust, holding 51% of the voting common stock, along with 100% of the Series A and Series B preferred shares. And what is the current valuation of that position based on the last financing round, I asked. Walter hesitated again. He sounded uncomfortable, as if saying the number out loud made it too real. Based on the capitalization table from the last injection, the position is valued at approximately $4.6 billion, with the total company valuation holding at $9 billion. Thank you, Walter, I said. That will be all. I ended the call. The silence that returned was different this time. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, like the room had been filled with concrete. Holden sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, the smirk dying a slow, painful death on his lips. He looked at the phone as if it were a venomous snake that had just bitten him. Douglas went pale. It was a terrifying transformation. The ruddy, healthy color of his face drained away in seconds, leaving him looking gray and old. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a decade. He did not see his daughter. He saw a predator. Marianne let out a small, strangled sound. Her hands, which had been perfectly manicured and steady all evening, began to shake violently. She clasped them together to stop the tremors, but her whole body seemed to vibrate with the shock. "It is not possible," Holden whispered. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the wall. It fell with a loud crash, but nobody flinched. "You can't have that kind of money. Grandpa left you $5 million. That is it. You can't turn $5 million into $4 billion. It is mathematically impossible. You are lying. You are running a scam." Elena stepped forward then. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bound documents. She did not toss them. She slid them across the table with precision. They came to a rest directly in front of Douglas. "It is not a scam." "Mr. Kincaid," Elena said, "it is compound interest, aggressive leverage, and 10 years of very smart, very high-risk maneuvering. Here are the audit trails. Here are the purchase orders for the debt. Here are the bank records showing the capital flow from Crescent Harbor into Kincaid Meridian." Douglas opened the file. His hands shook as he turned the pages. He saw the signatures. He saw the dates. He saw the undeniable truth printed in black and white. "You bought the debt," Douglas whispered, his voice hoarse. "When the bank wanted to foreclose in 2019, that was you." "Yes," I said. "And the fuel bridge loan last winter, when we couldn't pay the suppliers." "Yes," I said. "And the expansion financing," Holden shouted, pointing a finger at me. "The money for Nashville. The money that proved I was a genius." I looked at him calmly. "The money that kept you out of prison." "Holden," I corrected him, "you were trading while insolvent. If Crescent Harbor hadn't injected that capital, the auditors would have flagged you for fraud. I didn't fund Nashville because I believed in it. I funded it because if I hadn't, the company would have collapsed, and you would have been liable for gross negligence." Holden recoiled as if I had slapped him. He slumped against the sideboard, looking suddenly small inside his expensive suit. The narrative he had built, the story of the golden boy, the visionary, the chosen one, was disintegrating in real time. He wasn't the hero. He was the damsel in distress, and his sister was the one who had been paying the ransom. Why, Marianne asked. Her voice was thin and fragile, cracking under the weight of the moment. She looked at me with eyes full of tears, but they weren't tears of gratitude. They were tears of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. "If you had this money, if you were this successful, why did you let us treat you like that? Why did you sit there and let your brother mock you? Why did you make us worry about you?" I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. I kept my voice steady, because I didn't do it to impress you. "Mother," I said, "and I didn't do it to be part of the family. I did it because this company feeds 300 families, and Holden was driving it off a cliff. But the secrecy," Douglas said, looking up from the documents. He looked defeated. "Why the shell companies? Why the blind trust? You are a Kincaid. You could have walked in the front door." I leaned forward. The candlelight caught the reflection in my eyes. Could I asked. Think back. Dad, think back to Christmas. 11 years ago. I tried to walk in the front door. I brought you a binder full of research. I told you how to save the margins. And what did you say? You told me trucks run on diesel, not data. You told me to go find a husband. I looked at Holden. You told me I was playing video games. You said I didn't understand the real world. I looked back at Douglas. If I had come to you 5 years ago and said, Dad, I want to invest, would you have taken my money, or would you have patted me on the head and told me to let the men handle the business? If I had warned you about the debt, would you have listened, or would you have told me I was being negative? Douglas opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his plate. He knew the answer. We all knew the answer. You wouldn't have believed me, I said softly. You built your entire world on the idea that Holden is the genius and I am the failure. If I had tried to change that story with words, you would have laughed at me. So I changed it with money. I didn't ask for permission. I bought it. Holden looked up. His eyes were wild, desperate. So this is it, he spat. You are here to what? Fire us, evict us. Is that the plan? You want to humiliate us in our own house. I stood up. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark grounds of the estate. I had played on that lawn as a child. I had learned to ride a bike on that driveway. I am not here to humiliate you. Holden, I said, turning back to face them, I am here to stop you. I walked back to the table and rested my hand on the back of the chair again. The mystery investor you were waiting for, the one you thought was coming to validate you, the one you thought was going to hand you the CEO title and tell you that you were special. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. That person never existed. Every check I wrote wasn't a vote of confidence. It was a containment strategy. I wasn't funding your success. I was buying your mistakes so they wouldn't destroy the legacy. Holden sank into a chair. Not the one at the head of the table, but a side chair, far away from the center of power. He put his head in his hands. Marianne was weeping now. Soft, quiet sobs into her napkin. Douglas just stared at the papers, tracing the signature line on the debt purchase agreement. You own it all, Douglas whispered. The trucks, the terminals, the house. The corporate entity holds the mortgage on the estate. Yes, Elena clarified. Technically, Crescent Harbor allows you to reside here as part of the executive compensation package. Douglas looked at me. There was fear in his eyes, but there was also something else, a strange, grudging respect. He was a businessman, after all, and he knew a hostile takeover when he saw one. He just never imagined the raider would have his own last name. So what happens now? Douglas asked. I looked at the clock. It was 8:15. Now, I said, signaling Elena to close her briefcase. The dinner is over. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp, and this time, nobody is going to be late. I picked up my phone. I did not say goodbye. I did not hug my mother. I simply turned and walked out of the room. Elena following close behind. As I reached the doorway, I heard Holden's voice, small and broken. Ella. I stopped, but I did not turn around. You are going to ruin us, he said. I looked at the open door ahead of me, leading out into the night. No. Holden, I said, I already saved you. You just don't know it yet. I walked out of the house, leaving the door wide open behind me, letting the cold air rush in to clear the stagnation of 20 years. The investor had arrived, and she had work to do. The cold air I had let in through the front door was swirling around the dining room, but the temperature drop had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of absolute, irreversible exposure. I had dropped the bomb, and now I was watching the fallout settle over the prime rib and the heavy silver candlesticks. My father, Douglas, was the first to try to wrestle the world back into a shape he recognized. He did not look at the legal documents Elena had slid across the table. He looked at the walls, at the portraits of his ancestors, as if asking them to witness this insurrection. Then he slammed his open palm onto the mahogany table. The sound was not a gavel. It was a spasm of denial. This cannot be happening, he announced. His voice was loud, booming, the voice he used to intimidate union reps and junior dispatchers. Not in my house. You do not walk into my home with a stranger and threaten your family. Ella, I don't care what papers you have. I am your father, and I am the chairman of this board. I watched him, a decade ago. That voice would have made me shrink into my chair. It would have made me apologize for existing. But tonight, I just saw a man who had forgotten that respect is a currency, and he was overdrawn. I am not threatening you, Dad, I said. I am informing you. And this is not a family discussion. This is a shareholder notification. You are my daughter, he shouted, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple. Not right now, I replied. Right now. I am the entity that owns 51% of your voting stock, and that entity requires a competent management team. Holden, who had been slumped in his chair like a puppet with cut strings, suddenly jerked upright. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a frantic, scrambling survival instinct. He looked at the documents, then at me, calculating the angles. He realized that shouting wouldn't work, so he switched tracks. He put on his negotiator face, the one he used when he was trying to lowball a vendor. Okay, let's all take a breath, Holden said, holding up his hands. Ella, seriously, you made your point. You are the investor. That is impressive. I mean it. I underestimated you. We all did. He let out a short, nervous laugh. But let's be real. You don't want to run a logistics company. You are a coder. You live in Minneapolis. You don't know the first thing about managing a fleet of 2,000 trucks. So, here is what we do. We bring you on as a silent partner. We give you a board seat hell. We will give you 2. You keep the equity. I keep the CEO title. And we run this thing together, a family dynasty. I looked at him, marveling at the sheer density of his ego. Even with the evidence of his incompetence spread out before him, he still believed he was essential. Holden, I said, my voice quiet. You missed 3 debt covenants in 2 years. You falsified a compliance report to the Department of Transportation. You leased a warehouse for $12 million that is currently housing nothing but dust. I am not looking for a partner. I am looking for accountability. His face hardened. The negotiator vanished, replaced by the bully I had known since childhood. You can't just remove me, he snapped. The board won't support it. They are loyal to Dad. They are loyal to the name. The board has a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. Elena interjected. She had not moved from her spot by the sideboard. Her voice was cool water on a grease fire, and since Ms. Perez is the majority shareholder, the board serves her interests. If they vote to keep a CEO who has demonstrated gross negligence, they will be personally liable for the subsequent lawsuits. We have already prepared the files. Holden turned on her. You shut up. This is between us. It hasn't been between us for a long time. I said, it hasn't been between us since you decided to use the company credit line to cover your personal margin calls. The room went deadly silent. Marianne gasped. She looked at Holden, her eyes wide. Holden, is that true? Holden's mouth opened and closed. He looked at Douglas, then at his mother, panic flaring behind his eyes. It was a detail I wasn't supposed to know. It was buried deep in the miscellaneous expense accounts, that was a temporary liquidity issue. Holden stammered, I paid it back, mostly. You embezzled corporate funds to gamble on tech stocks. I said, and you lost. And then you had Dad sign off on a consulting fee to cover the hole in the ledger. I looked at Douglas. He refused to meet my eyes. He stared at his wineglass, his shame radiating off him in waves. He knew. Of course he knew. He had covered for the golden boy because admitting Holden was a thief would mean admitting he had bet on the wrong horse. Marianne let out a sob. It was a ragged, wet sound. She put her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. How could you do this to us? Ella, she cried. Her voice was muffled, but the accusation was clear. Not, how could Holden steal, but how could Ella expose it? We have a reputation in this town. She wept, lifting her tear-streaked face. The Kincaids are pillars of the community. If this gets out, if people know, we will be laughingstocks. You are going to destroy your brother's life over money. Over some trucks, I felt a crack in my chest. A hairline fracture where the old hurt lived. Even now, with the truth laid bare. Her first instinct was to protect the image, not the integrity. Her fear wasn't that her son was a criminal. Her fear was that the country club would find out. I am not doing this to destroy him, Mother. I said, I am doing this to save the company from him, and I am doing it to save the 300 employees who would lose their jobs when he inevitably bankrupts the firm next year. You are being cruel, she whispered. You have always been so hard, so unyielding. You could have come to us. We are a family. You could have talked to us. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that hurt my throat. I stood up and walked to the fireplace, leaning against the mantel. The heat of the fire was intense, but I felt cold. I tried. I said, I tried twice. I looked at Douglas. Do you remember June of 2018? I sent you an email. I marked it urgent. I attached a risk assessment of the fuel hedging strategy Holden was using. I told you that if the market turned, we would be exposed to $6 million in losses. Douglas frowned, his brow furrowing. I get a lot of emails. Ella, you replied to it. I said, you wrote back 2 words. Stick to computers. Douglas winced. And then, I continued, my voice trembling slightly. 3 years ago, when you had the liquidity crisis, I called you. I offered to introduce you to a consultant who could help restructure the debt. I didn't say it was me. I just wanted to help. You told me I was nagging. You told me I was jealous of Holden's success. You hung up on me. I walked back to the table and placed my hands on the wood. Leaning in so I was eye level with my father, I didn't hide from you because I wanted to be mysterious. Dad, I hid because every time I showed my face, you told me I didn't belong. You forced me to be a stranger, so I became the most powerful stranger in your life. Douglas looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, watery with age and whiskey and regret. He looked at Holden, who was staring sullenly at the floor. He looked at Marianne, who was lost in her own vanity, and then he looked at me. For a moment, the bluster was gone. The titan of industry was gone. He was just a tired old man realizing he had thrown away the diamond to keep the stone. I didn't see you, he whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I know, I said, and now it is too late. Elena stepped forward, checking her watch. She was the metronome keeping time in the chaos. Mr. Kincaid, Mrs. Kincaid, she said respectfully but firmly. We have lodged the necessary paperwork with the state. An emergency board meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at the corporate headquarters. She looked at Holden. Your attendance is required. Mr. Kincaid, but your voting rights have been suspended pending the outcome of the independent review. Security will have a temporary badge for you at the front desk. Your executive access has been revoked as of 5 minutes ago. Revoked. Holden spat. Standing up again, you locked me out of my own email. We secured the company assets. Elena corrected. I picked up my phone. I did not want to stay for the weeping. I did not want to stay for the bargaining. I had done what I came to do. I am leaving now. I said, I will see you in the boardroom tomorrow. I turned and walked toward the hallway. Elena fell into step behind me. I heard the scrape of footsteps. Fast, angry footsteps. Ella, wait. It was Holden. He followed me out of the dining room, catching up to me in the high-ceilinged foyer, right beneath the crystal chandelier that cost more than my first year's salary. He grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, desperate. I pulled my arm away, stepping back. Don't touch me. Holden stood between me and the door. His face was a mask of sweat and terror. The bravado was gone. The negotiator was gone. This was just raw fear. You can't do this, he hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper so our parents wouldn't hear. You don't understand. I need this. I am the CEO. That is who I am. If you take this away, who am I? That is a question you should have asked yourself 10 years ago, I said. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Ella, please, think about the name, the Kincaid name. It means something. You need us. You need the family legitimacy. You can't just run this thing as an outsider. People won't respect you. You need me to be the face of it." I looked at him. I looked at the brother who had spent a lifetime making me feel small so he could feel big. I saw the hollowness inside him, the vast, empty space where his character should have been. He thought I needed him. He thought that despite everything, the billions of dollars, the control, the strategy, I was still the little sister who craved approval. I shook my head slowly. "You are wrong." "Holden," I said. I stepped around him, moving toward the heavy oak door. I put my hand on the latch. "I don't need the family name. I never did." I opened the door. The night air rushed in again, cold and purifying. "You needed my silence," I said, looking back at him one last time, "and you can't afford it anymore." I walked out onto the porch. Elena followed, closing the door firmly behind us. The sound of the latch clicking into place was final. It was the sound of a vault locking. I walked down the steps to where Elena's car was waiting. My legs felt shaky, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. I felt a phantom urge to go back, to hug my mother, to tell my father I loved him, to try to fix the emotional wreckage I had just created. But I kept walking. Closure is a myth. It is a fairy tale people tell themselves to sleep better at night. You don't get closure from people who cannot see you. You don't get closure from a family that values a lie more than the truth. I got into the back seat of the car. Elena got into the driver's seat. She didn't say anything. She just started the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the house. The lights were still on in the dining room. I could imagine them in there, Douglas staring at the wall, Marianne crying over the centerpiece, Holden pacing the floor like a trapped animal. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I just felt light. The weight of the secret was gone, and for the first time in my life, the road ahead was entirely my own. The morning sun hitting the glass facade of the Kincaid Meridian headquarters in downtown Louisville felt less like a new day and more like an interrogation lamp. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the executive conference room on the 40th floor was scrubbed clean and chilled to a precise 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the humid, emotional heat of the dinner party the night before. I walked into the room with Elena Markham a step behind me. I was not wearing the comfortable sweaters I usually wore to my remote job at Summit Grid. I was wearing a navy suit that was sharp enough to cut glass. Purchased 3 years ago for this exact hour, the boardroom was already full, the urgent governance notice Elena had issued electronically at 8:15 the previous night had done its job. The 12 members of the board were seated, their postures varying from defensive to confused. My father, Douglas, sat at the head of the table, but he looked like a guest in his own home. He was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, his hands clasped tightly over a leather folio. He did not look up when I entered. Holden sat to his right. He had clearly not slept. His hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes were manic, darting around the room, assessing loyalty, counting votes. When he saw me, his jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. I did not take a seat at the foot of the table. I walked to the front, standing next to the projection screen. Elena placed her briefcase on the credenza and began distributing thick-bound dossiers to each director. The sound of heavy paper hitting the polished wood was the only noise in the room. "Good morning," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the room, it carried to every corner. "I am Ella Perez. As of yesterday evening, the trust I control, Crescent Harbor, is the majority shareholder of this company. We are here to discuss the future." A murmur rippled through the room. I scanned the faces. I knew them all from my research, though most of them had not seen me since I was a teenager. There was the old guard men like Robert Vance and Arthur Miller, who had been golfing with my father since the 80s. They looked at me with a mixture of betrayal and confusion. To them, business was about loyalty, and I was an insurgent. Then there were the skeptics newer directors brought in to modernize the firm, who had been quietly outvoted by the Kincaid family block for years. They looked curious. They were looking at the numbers Elena had just handed them, and I could see the dawn of realization in their eyes. And then there were the others, the ones I was most interested in. Holden stood up before I could continue. He buttoned his jacket, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a politician who knows the polls are crashing. "Before we begin," Holden said, his voice smooth, practically dripping with false charm, "I want to address the elephant in the room. My sister has acquired a significant stake in our debt. It is a bold move, and honestly, I applaud the initiative. But let's be clear. This is a family matter that has spilled into the boardroom. We appreciate the capital infusion. Ella, really. But operating a logistics network requires experience, not just a checkbook." He looked around the table, trying to make eye contact with his allies. "We cannot let a hostile financial maneuver disrupt our operations." Holden continued, "We are in the middle of a critical expansion in Nashville. We need stability. We need the leadership that has brought us this far." I waited for him to finish. I did not interrupt. I let him hang himself with his own platitudes. When he sat down, looking pleased with his little speech, I signaled to Elena. She tapped a key on her laptop, and the screen behind me illuminated. It was not a slide about family, it was a slide about math. "Stability is exactly why I am here," I said. I pointed to the screen. It displayed a graph of the company's operating cash flow over the last 24 months. It was a nosedive. "This is not a hostile takeover," I said, keeping my tone clinical. "This is a rescue intervention. Under the current leadership, Kincaid Meridian has missed 3 primary debt covenants. We have failed a preliminary safety audit that, had I not intervened with emergency capital, would have grounded 20% of the fleet. And the Nashville expansion my brother just mentioned, I clicked to the next slide. It showed the occupancy rates of the new facility, 0%. The Nashville facility is burning $400,000 a month in carry costs. I said, "It is an empty shell. It was built on a speculative lease that no data supported." Holden slammed his hand on the table. "That is a long-term play," he shouted, the charm evaporating instantly. "You are looking at quarterly results. You have to look at the 5-year horizon. I am looking at the bankruptcy horizon." "Holden," I shot back, "and it is 3 months away." The room went silent. The word bankruptcy has a way of sucking the oxygen out of a corporate environment. Robert Vance, one of the old guard, cleared his throat. He looked at Douglas, then at me. "Ella, honey," he started, using a diminutive that made my skin crawl. "These are serious accusations. Your father has led this company for 40 years. Are you saying he doesn't know what he's doing?" I looked at Robert. I respected his loyalty, even if it was misplaced. "I am saying that my father trusted the wrong operational data." I said, "I am not asking for revenge. I am asking for a governance overhaul. I am demanding a full forensic audit of all related party transactions, lease approvals, and debt exposure." At the mention of related party transactions, I saw 2 heads snap up, William Sterling and Gerald Ford. They were longtime board members, stalwarts of the Kincaid Circle. They had always voted with Holden on his expansion projects. They had always silenced the dissenters, and now I knew why. I clicked the remote again. The screen changed. It displayed a complex web of vendor contracts for the Nashville construction project. I promised you I would bring facts. I said, "So let's talk about the construction bids for the new hub." The general contractor, Vector Industrial, was awarded the contract without a competitive bidding process. Their bid was $2 million higher than the industry standard. I looked directly at William Sterling. Vector Industrial is owned by a holding company registered in Delaware. I said, "But if you dig through the shell companies," which I did, "you find that the primary beneficiary is the brother-in-law of Director Sterling." William's face turned a mottled shade of gray. That is a coincidence," William stammered. "I recused myself from that vote." "The minutes show you voted yes," I said, holding up a printout. "And you failed to disclose the conflict of interest. That is a breach of fiduciary duty." "William, it is actionable fraud." I turned my gaze to Gerald Ford and the land lease. I continued. "The land in Nashville was purchased from a trust that lists Gerald Ford's wife as a trustee. You sold the company land at 40% above market value. Gerald. The room erupted. The quiet tension shattered into chaos. Directors were shouting over each other. The skeptics were looking at William and Gerald with open hostility. The old guard looked like they had been punched in the stomach. They had tolerated Holden's incompetence because they thought it was just youthful arrogance. They didn't know they were sitting at a table with thieves. Holden stood up again, his face twisted with rage. "This is illegal," he screamed. "You hacked our records. You can't use this. It is public record if you know where to look," I said calmly, "and I am the majority shareholder. I have a right to know where my money went." Holden looked at Douglas. "Dad, do something. She is tearing the board apart." Douglas sat frozen. He looked at William, his friend of 30 years. He looked at Gerald. He saw the guilt written on their faces. He realized that while he was busy playing the patriarch, his loyal friends had been picking his pockets. Douglas closed his eyes. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. I waited for the noise to die down. It took a full minute. When silence returned, it was fragile and tense. Holden tried one last tactic: intimidation. He walked around the table, approaching me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, used to physically dominating a space. "You are a little girl playing with fire," he hissed, leaning in close to me. "You think these papers make you the boss? The drivers listen to me. The unions listen to me. If you try to push me out, I will burn this place down. I will walk, and I will take the senior staff with me. You will be queen of a graveyard." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked him in the eye. "You really think they follow you because they respect you?" I asked softly. "They follow you because they need a paycheck. And right now, I am the only one who can guarantee that check clears next week." A voice spoke up from the far end of the table. "She is right." Everyone turned. It was Silas Thorne. Silas was the director Holden had mocked for years. He was an actuary by trade, a man who wore ill-fitting suits and obsessed over risk tables. Holden called him the bore. Douglas usually ignored him. Silas stood up. He held the dossier Elena had given him. He had already read the executive summary and the financial appendices. "I have reviewed the financing terms from Crescent Harbor," Silas said. His voice was dry, dusty, and absolutely authoritative. "And I have looked at the liquidity ratios Ella has presented. If we do not accept this restructuring, the company will be insolvent within 60 days. Silas looked at Holden over the rim of his glasses. "And regarding the Nashville contracts, if these allegations are true, and the documentation looks solid, we are facing massive liability. We need to distance the company from this immediately." Silas looked at me. "I move that we adopt the shareholders' proposal," he said. Holden looked at Silas as if the furniture had suddenly started speaking. You are backing her. I am backing the math." "Holden," Silas said, "I always back the math." Elena stepped forward. "We have a motion on the floor," she said. "The proposal is as follows. Douglas Kincaid will transition to the role of Chairman Emeritus, effective immediately, relinquishing operational control. Holden Kincaid will be placed on immediate administrative suspension pending the results of a third-party forensic audit. An interim CEO will be appointed by Crescent Harbor Trust. I need a second," Elena said. The room held its breath. Robert Vance, the leader of the old guard, looked at Douglas. He looked at the devastation on his friend's face. He looked at the evidence of betrayal by William and Gerald. He realized the era was over. "Second," Robert whispered. Holden gasped. "Et tu?" Robert didn't look at him. He looked at the table. "All in favor?" Elena asked. Silas raised his hand. The skeptics raised their hands. Robert raised his hand. Slowly, heavily. Then, one by one, the rest of the board raised their hands. Even William and Gerald, terrified of the lawsuit I was undoubtedly about to file, raised their hands in a pathetic attempt to show cooperation. The only hand that stayed down was Douglas's. He didn't vote. He just sat there, staring at the polished wood, mourning the death of his illusion. "The motion carries," Elena said. Holden stood there, alone in the center of the room. He looked at the sea of hands against him. He looked at me. The realization hit him. It wasn't just a loss. It was an eviction. Fine. Holden spat. He grabbed his leather portfolio from the table. He didn't look at Douglas. He didn't look at his mother's empty chair. She hadn't even been invited. He looked only at me, and the hatred in his eyes was pure and undiluted. "You think you won," Holden said, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just sit in the big chair and run things? You have no idea what is buried in those files. Ella, you have no idea what I did to keep this company alive." "I do know," I said calmly. "That is why I ordered the audit." Holden laughed, a sharp, manic sound. "Enjoy the wreckage, sister, because when the authorities see what is in the books, you won't be the savior. You will be the accessory." He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy glass door so hard the frame rattled. The vibration hung in the air. I looked at the board. I looked at my father. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said. "Now, if you will excuse us. Silas, Elena, and I have work to do." Meeting adjourned, as the directors filed out, silent and shell-shocked. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the heavy, cold weight of the promise Holden had just made. He wasn't done, and he was right about one thing. I didn't know everything yet. The audit wasn't just going to be a cleanup, it was going to be an excavation. The headline hit the local business journals 48 hours after the board meeting, and it was written exactly the way Holden wanted it. The Lexington Herald leader ran it on the front page of the business section. "Estranged daughter stages hostile takeover of Kincaid Logistics." Holden had been busy. He had not gone home to reflect on his failures. He had gone straight to his friends at the country club and the local press, spinning a narrative of victimhood that was breathtaking in its audacity. According to the article, I was a predatory vulture from the north, a bitter woman who had used a shadowy trust to steal the company from her ailing father and hard-working brother. He painted himself as the martyr, the visionary cut down in his prime by family betrayal. He did not mention the debt covenants. He did not mention the empty warehouse in Nashville. He only talked about tradition, legacy, and how I had shattered it all for profit. The fallout was immediate and social. In Lexington, business is personal, and the Kincaid name was royalty. I became the villain overnight. My phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was my mother. "Marianne, you have done it," she said. Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves being crushed. "You have humiliated us completely." "I am not the one who called the newspaper." "Mother," I said, cradling my coffee cup in the kitchen of the corporate apartment I was renting. "Holden leaked the story. Because he is fighting for his life," she cried. "Do you know what happened today? I went to the charity brunch at the club. Janice Miller turned her back on me. People were whispering, 'Ella.' They were looking at me like I was the mother of a traitor. You have made us pariahs." It was always about the image. It was never about the reality. She did not care that her son had cooked the books. She cared that Janice Miller was being rude at brunch. "I am sorry you feel embarrassed," I said, keeping my voice flat. "But the truth will come out in the audit. Holden is trying to win in the press because he knows he lost in the boardroom. You need to fix this," she demanded. "Issue a statement. Say it is a partnership. Give him his title back." "I cannot do that," I said. "Then do not bother coming to Sunday dinner," she snapped. "You are not welcome in this house until you make this right." The line went dead. I stared at the phone. It hurt, but it was a dull, old ache, like a fracture that had never healed properly. I set the phone down and went to work. Holden did not stop with the press. By noon on Wednesday, we were served with legal papers. He had filed for an emergency injunction in the state court, claiming improper influence, breach of shareholder agreement, and bad faith governance. He was arguing that Crescent Harbor Trust had manipulated the stock price to force a takeover, and that my actions were detrimental to the company's long-term stability. It was a desperate, flailing move, but it was dangerous. An injunction could freeze our ability to operate. It could lock the bank accounts and stop us from making payroll. Elena Markham was waiting for it. We sat in the temporary war room we had set up in the executive suite. The table was covered in stacks of paper. "This is standard interference," Elena said, flipping through the filing. He is hoping a local judge will be sympathetic to the Kincaid name and pause everything just to be safe. Can he win? I asked. No, Elena said. She tapped a thick binder next to her laptop. Because we have this. She had compiled a fortress of compliance letters. We had the trustee records showing every single purchase order was legal. We had the minutes from the board meeting where the directors, including Holden's own allies, had voted to remove him. We had the debt agreement signed by Douglas himself. We are not going to fight him in the papers, Elena said. We are going to bury him in procedure. I will have this dismissed by Friday. He is alleging bad faith. We have 3 years of emails showing you saving the company from insolvency. That is not bad faith. That is charity. While Elena fought the legal battle, I went hunting for the money. The independent audit team I had hired was tearing through the servers, but I knew where to look. I had spent years analyzing the company from the outside, and now that I was on the inside, I could see the seams in the tapestry. There was something wrong with the lease agreements. The numbers for the fleet leases didn't match the depreciation schedules I had seen in the public filings. There was a discrepancy of nearly $4 million. I tracked the signature on the lease adjustments. It wasn't Holden's. It was Marcus Tate, the chief financial officer. Marcus was a quiet man, a numbers guy who had been with the firm for 5 years. He was the one who always nodded during Holden's presentations, the one who made the spreadsheets look pretty. I realized with a jolt that Holden couldn't have done any of this alone. He was too disorganized. He needed an architect to build the house of cards. I called Marcus into my office on Thursday afternoon. He walked in looking like a man walking to the gallows. He was sweating. Despite the air conditioning, he carried a notepad, clutching it like a shield. Sit down, Marcus, I said. He sat. He didn't look at me. He looked at the view of the Ohio River out the window. I have been looking at the off-balance sheet vehicles used for the trailer leases. I said, specifically, the ones routed through a subsidiary in Nevada. Marcus flinched. I continued, my voice calm. It looks like you were capitalizing operating expenses to inflate the EBITDA. You were moving maintenance costs into the lease principal. That made the quarterly profits look $2 million higher than they actually were. Marcus stayed silent. He was pale. That is securities fraud. Marcus, I said, and since we have bank debt involved, it is also bank fraud. He finally looked at me. His eyes were terrified. Holden told me it was temporary. Marcus whispered. He said we just needed to get through the expansion phase. He said the revenue from Nashville would cover the gap before the auditors saw it. I was just following orders. You are the CFO. I said, you do not follow orders to break the law. You are the gatekeeper. I slid a piece of paper across the desk. I am going to give you one option. I said, this is a letter of resignation. It cites personal health reasons. You will sign it, and you will leave this building today. You will cooperate fully with the forensic audit team. You will walk them through every single transaction you hid. And if I don't, he asked, his voice shaking, then I hand this file to the FBI. I said, and you won't just lose your job. You will go to federal prison. Marcus stared at the letter. He picked up the pen. His hand trembled so much the signature was barely legible. He left 10 minutes later. I watched him walk to the elevator. A man whose career was over because he couldn't say no to a Kincaid. The atmosphere in the building was toxic. The employees were terrified. They had read the articles. They had heard the rumors. They saw the CFO escorted out of the building. To them, I was the monster who was dismantling their livelihood. Holden was playing into that fear. He had been texting the union representatives, telling them that I was planning to sell the fleet and outsource the drivers. He was trying to organize a walkout. I needed to stop the bleeding. I set up a town hall meeting for Friday morning. I did not rent a hotel ballroom. I did not order catering. I simply sent a link to every employee email address and set up a camera in the conference room. When the red light on the webcam turned on, I saw the participant count climbing. 500, 800, 1,200. They were watching from dispatch centers, from home offices, and from tablets in truck cabs at rest stops across the country. I looked into the lens. I did not smile. I did not try to be charming. My name is Ella Perez, I began. By now, You have read the stories in the paper. You have heard that I am here to strip the company and sell it for parts. I paused. That is a lie. I leaned forward. I am here for one reason: to make sure your paycheck clears next Friday. And the Friday after that, I held up a piece of paper. This is the confirmation of a capital injection I authorized this morning. It covers payroll, benefits, and the 401k match that hasn't been paid in 3 months. I saw the chat box on the side of the screen scrolling wildly. People were asking about the 401k. They didn't know it hadn't been funded. Holden had hidden that too. My brother, Holden Kincaid, has been suspended because the company was out of money. I said bluntly. We were weeks away from closing the doors. I stepped in to prevent that. I'm not going to promise you a new cafeteria or a fancy holiday party, but I promise you this: if you drive the miles, you will get paid. If you work the dock, you will get paid. We are going back to basics. Jobs first, stability first, everything else is noise. I ended the call. The reaction wasn't instantaneous, but it was steady. The threat of a walkout evaporated when the direct deposits hit the accounts that afternoon. The drivers didn't care about the family drama or the society pages. They cared that their fuel cards worked and their checks didn't bounce. Holden tried to rally a protest in the parking lot on Saturday, but only 3 people showed up. The rest were busy working. By Monday, the injunction was dismissed. The judge looked at our compliance documents and tossed Holden's filing out of court in 20 minutes. We had control, we had stability, we had the truth. Or so I thought. Late Monday evening, Elena walked into my office. The sun had set, and the city lights of Louisville were twinkling below us. The office was quiet. Elena closed the door behind her. She never closed the door unless it was catastrophe level. She sat down opposite me. She didn't open her laptop. She just held a single file folder. The audit is finished, I asked, rubbing my temples. The preliminary review of the operational accounts is done. Elena said. Her voice was strange. It lacked its usual crisp confidence. It sounded heavy. And I asked, Marcus confessed to the lease fraud. We know about the Nashville contracts. What else is there? Elena placed the folder on the desk. She placed her hand over it, as if she didn't want to let the information out. Ella, she said, we found a separate set of accounts. They weren't attached to the main ledger. They were hidden in a legacy system that hasn't been updated in 10 years. Okay, I said, feeling a cold prickle on the back of my neck. What is in them? Elena took a breath. We thought Holden was borrowing money to cover the expansion. She said, we thought it was incompetence and ego. She slid the folder toward me. It wasn't just expansion, Ella. It wasn't just greed. I opened the folder. I looked at the summary page. I looked at the beneficiaries of the wire transfers. I looked at the dates. My breath caught in my throat. This dates back 5 years, I whispered. Elena nodded. Holden wasn't just cooking the books to save his job, she said softly. He was paying blackmail. I looked up at her, the room spinning slightly. Blackmail, I asked. Who? Elena pointed to the name on the second page. A shell company connected to a gambling syndicate in Las Vegas, she said, and another one connected to an offshore account in the Caymans. She leaned back, her face grim. He didn't just lose money on stocks. Ella, he borrowed from loan sharks. He borrowed from people who break legs, and he used the company accounts to pay the interest. That is why the cash flow was always zero. He was funneling millions out the back door to keep himself alive. I stared at the numbers. It was worse than fraud. It was criminal endangerment of the entire enterprise. But that is not the worst part, Elena said. I looked at her. How can it be worse? Elena turned the page to the final document in the stack. It was a promissory note. It was signed 3 months ago. Look at the cosigner, Elena said. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was shaky, weak, but unmistakable. Douglas Kincaid. My father knew. Elena said, he didn't just cover for the incompetence. He signed the guarantee on the illegal loans. He knew Holden was in debt to the mob, and he mortgaged the company assets to protect him. I felt the air leave my lungs. I sat back in my chair, the file slipping from my fingers. It is worse than we thought. Elena said, echoing the silence in the room. We didn't just have a corporate cleanup on our hands. We had a federal crime. And my father wasn't a victim. He was a co-conspirator. The victory I thought I had won suddenly felt like ashes in my mouth. I had come to save the company from my brother. I didn't realize I would have to destroy my father to do it. The special shareholder meeting was not held in the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor. It was held in the auditorium on the ground level, a space usually reserved for holiday parties and town halls. This time, however, there were no balloons and no speeches about quarterly bonuses. The room was packed. Every chair was filled with board members, legal counsel, key investors, and the senior management team. The air conditioning was humming, but it could not scrub the scent of impending doom from the air. I stood at the podium. To my right sat Elena Markham, her face composed and terrifyingly neutral. To my left sat the independent auditor, a man named Saracen, who had spent the last 72 hours dissecting the corpse of Kincaid Meridian's finances. My father, Douglas, and my brother, Holden, sat in the front row. They were not on the stage. For the first time in the history of the company, the Kincaid men were part of the audience, looking up at the leadership rather than looking down on the workers. I did not waste time with pleasantries. We are here to review the final findings of the forensic audit. I said. My voice echoed slightly in the large room. The investigation is complete. What we found is not a case of bad luck. It is not a case of market volatility. It is a case of systemic theft and catastrophic failure of governance. I nodded to Saracen. He stepped up to the microphone. He did not use euphemisms. We have uncovered a network of self-dealing contracts totaling $42 million over the last 5 years. Saracen stated, these contracts were awarded to shell companies controlled by Holden Kincaid. Furthermore, we have traced $12 million in unauthorized wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and an unregulated lending syndicate in Nevada. A gasp went through the room. It wasn't a theatrical gasp. It was the sound of 50 people realizing their stock options might be worthless. Holden stood up. He had to. It was the instinct of a drowning man trying to climb onto a piece of driftwood. I was doing it for the company, he shouted, turning to face the shareholders. You do not understand the pressure we were under. The banks cut us off. I had to go to alternative lenders to keep the fleet moving. I took those loans to pay for fuel. I took the risks to keep your jobs safe. I stepped back to the microphone. That is a lie. Holden, I said. I pressed a button on the console. The massive screen behind me lit up. It showed a split-screen comparison. On the left was the date of a $2 million wire transfer from the alternative lender. On the right was the bank record of Holden's personal brokerage account receiving a deposit of $1.8 million the very next day. You didn't borrow money to buy fuel, I said, my voice cutting through his defense like a laser. You borrowed money to cover your personal gambling debts and your failed day trading losses. And when you couldn't pay the sharks back, you embezzled company funds to pay the interest. You didn't leverage the company to save us. You mortgaged our future to save your own skin. Holden stared at the screen. The proof was 50 feet tall. There was no spinning it. There was no charm that could dismantle the math. He sank back into his chair, effectively shrinking until he looked like a child wearing his father's suit. But the hardest truth was yet to come. I looked at Douglas. He was staring at his hands, his shoulders hunched. He looked like a man who had been carrying a stone mountain on his back for a decade and had finally collapsed. The audit revealed one more thing, I said, softening my voice just a fraction. I clicked the remote. The screen changed to display a series of corporate guarantees. These were the documents that pledged the company's physical assets, the trucks, the terminals, the headquarters itself as collateral for Holden's illegal loans. At the bottom of every page was a signature. It was not Holden's. Douglas Kincaid knew. I said. The room turned to look at the patriarch, the legend, the man whose name was on the building. He didn't start the fraud. I continued, but he found out about it 3 years ago, and instead of reporting it, instead of firing the CEO who was robbing the firm, he covered it up. He signed these guarantees to keep the lenders quiet. He risked 3,000 jobs to protect one reputation. Marianne, sitting beside Douglas, let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She looked at her husband with horror. She had spent her life believing in the mythology of the Kincaid excellence. She had belittled me for years because I didn't fit that mold. Now she realized the mold was filled with rot. The tradition she defended wasn't honor. It was denial dressed up in pride. Douglas stood up slowly. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at me. I couldn't let him fail. Douglas whispered. The microphone caught it. It was a confession. He is my son, Ella. He is the legacy. If he went down, the name went down. You set yourself on fire to keep him warm. Dad, I said, and you burned the rest of us with you. I turned to the board members seated in the front row. You have the report. I said, you have the evidence. The time for loyalty to a ghost is over. I am calling for a vote. It was instantaneous. There was no debate. There was no hesitation. The board voted unanimously to remove Holden Kincaid from all positions and to refer the audit findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Holden didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just sat there, staring at the screen, watching his life dissolve into pixels. Then came the second vote. I walked down the steps of the stage and stood in front of my father. The room was deadly silent. Dad, I said, you have a choice. The board can vote to terminate you for cause, which will strip you of your severance and humiliate you in the public record, or you can resign. Right now. You can cite health reasons. You can walk away with some dignity left. Douglas looked at me. For the first time, his eyes were clear. The fog of ego was gone. He looked at the daughter he had dismissed as a background character. The girl he told to go find a husband because she couldn't handle business. He saw the strength in my posture. He saw the mercy in my offer. He realized, 20 years too late, that the successor he had been praying for had been sitting at his table the whole time. I resign, he said. His voice cracked, but it was audible. Elena handed him a pen and a single sheet of paper. He signed it against the back of the chair in front of him. It was over. The reign of the Kincaid men ended not with a bang, but with the scratch of a ballpoint pen. I returned to the podium, effective immediately. I announced, we are implementing a new governance structure. We are bringing in a professional, external CEO with experience in turnaround logistics. I will remain as chairwoman of the board to ensure oversight. We are instituting a transparent financial tracking system that every shareholder can access. I looked at the camera broadcasting to the employees and to the workers. Your pension fund is being replenished today from the Crescent Harbor reserves. We are selling the Nashville facility to recoup the losses. We are going back to what we do best, moving freight, on time, safely. The drama ends today. The meeting adjourned. The room cleared out in a hush. People moving softly as if leaving a church. I walked out into the lobby. The afternoon sun was streaming in. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, but clean. Marianne was waiting for me near the exit. She looked older than she had that morning. Her makeup was smudged. She was alone. Douglas had gone to his office to pack up his things, and Holden had left through the back exit to meet with his criminal defense attorney. Ella, Marianne said. She reached out a hand, then pulled it back. Mother, I acknowledged her. What happens now? She asked. Can we come back from this? Can we be a family again? We can have dinner on Sunday. Just us. No business. We can start over. I looked at her. I saw the desperation in her eyes, the need to pretend that we could just sweep the wreckage under the rug and put a nice centerpiece on top of it. She wanted forgiveness. She wanted the comfort of the status quo. I shook my head gently. No, Mother, I said, we can't start over. We are not back at zero. We are at a new place. But you saved us, she pleaded. You saved the company. Doesn't that mean you forgive us? I saved the company because it was the right thing to do. I said, forgiveness is something else. Forgiveness requires change, and I need to see if you can respect me without my checkbook before I sit at your table again. I stepped past her, moving toward the glass doors. I won't be coming to dinner this Sunday, I said. Or next Sunday. I will call you when I'm ready. I didn't wait for her answer. I walked out of the building. My car was waiting at the curb. Elena was already in the passenger seat, tapping away on her phone, managing the transition. I stopped for a moment before getting in. I looked back at the headquarters. I thought about the first time I walked into this building as a child, holding my father's hand, thinking he was a giant. I thought about the door to the dining room, the one I had been afraid to open for so many years. The story began with a doorbell ringing, with me on the inside wishing I was someone else. It ended with me walking out, fully myself. I realized then that power isn't about shouting the loudest in the boardroom. It isn't about having your name on the building. Power is the ability to close a door and know that it will stay locked until you decide to open it. It is boundaries. And finally, mine were made of steel. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed the journey of Ella Perez and her fight for justice. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are tuning in from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts on the ending. If you enjoyed this revenge drama, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this story with even more people. See you in the next one.